while you just warm up and think about questions or comments, let me just ask the two of you, what do you think of Erik's argument that really very few of us understand that what human rights is about? What do you think about it? We seem to believe that it is something when it is something entirely different. Yeah? Please? Yeah?
Well, I think what Erik was mentioning is that, in fact, freedom of free speech or freedom of expression, as we call it, is at the very heart of human rights. But he seems to suggest that other rights, it's not at the pinnacle, but other rights flow from them. If we do not have a free speech, we cannot have other rights. But he has a more a view which is more complicated than that. I'll leave it to him to explain the rest of his rights.
Right, okay. But Erik, when you listen to Ourveena's description about how they work in, for instance, the African Commission on Human Rights, is this the right way to do it, or is this an example of how it is being misunderstood? Because of course Ourveena is talking about progress in Gambia, Malawi, Botswana, but to you, is that not real progress in the way that you're looking at freedom of expression? Is it examples of goods and not a right?
Well, yeah. In other words, I guess one of the things that I would recommend is that if it's true that free speech cannot just be another right, but is the very possibility, the very precondition for the possibility of a human rights system even to arise, then we have to look at all rights in a sense, but above all at the degree to which people are free to safely agitate for any right at all. It could be for a right that has nothing to do with free speech. The question is, how safe are they to criticize the present state of affairs, to make recommendations, to petition, to demonstrate, again, to mock, and so forth. So in a sense, I wouldn't want to isolate sort of free speech cases, right? I want to do the opposite, integrate them into the totality of any regime. And so, you know, in a sense, I'm arguing that political freedom is nothing but free speech.
Right.
That's the only form that free speech ultimately takes. That's the only form that political freedom ultimately takes, is free speech, right? And so if you don't have a regime of political freedom, there's no way in which you have a regime of human rights.
I mean, this must make a lot of sense with your experience from Russia.
Well, I don't want to look at this from a theoretical point of view, because if we go into this discussion, whether it's like human rights or like a good, so it's like all about the...
But the idea that the freedom of expression is, in a sense, the core, the very core of political...
I think it's a core of human rights concept. I think everybody who works with human rights in general, all the lawyers are quite agree on the issue that there are no other rights can be guaranteed if the right to information and freedom of expression is not there. So this is kind of like obvious things. But being a practicing lawyer from a jurisdiction which doesn't actually value the human being, the life, the right to life, that actually jeopardizes the whole concept when we talk about whether it's right or...
Let's have an example. You're saying, I mean, in Europe we are banning certain Russian propaganda.
Right.
You said this is not the right way to go about it.
It's counterproductive.
Why? Why?
Why? Because, well, it gives Russian regime, the propaganda, another argument,
Right.
saying that, okay, if you are advocating for free speech and free flow of information, why don't you just allow this particular part of information to be accessible for those who want to read this, for those who want to analyze it, for their alternative source of information? If you punish us, we'll punish
But
you.
the argument, of course, is that people believe it. In Europe also, people tend to believe the propaganda is true.
Well, I don't think that RT, let's say in Spain, will actually change the mind of Spanish people. I don't trust that if RT will be accessible. I have to make it clear. I'm not trying to support RT, right? This is not that we're trying to, spread around the world, but we have to know the rhetoric, let's say, of the enemy,
Yeah.
of the opponent, as it is. We have to see how they use it, how they target people. So if you just block it, you also will not understand how it works, why it's so effective. Propaganda is always effective. It was effective in Rwanda. It was effective in Nazi Germany. It was effective always. So if we just hide ourselves from that, we won't be able to secure our people with free information. And the whole discussion about whether it's a human rights or a good, it's good if you're in theory. It's good if you are a professor and go in depth for the books, for the textbooks, for students. But if you look at this as a practicing lawyer, you see that when people are really struggling to survive, the whole dialogue, the whole discussion about whether there is a human rights, whether it's important or not, it's so artificial for them. We have to deliver them things, understanding that human rights is a very natural. Without that, you cannot live. You cannot actually support your children. You cannot raise them. You cannot educate them. You cannot have dignity as a human being. So that has to be natural and not theoretical. So that, from my perspective, it's very important to support any society with the democratic values, and it should be very natural. Then people will actually value that.
Right.
They will support this and understand this.
Flemming Rose, editor of Frihedsbrevet. I just want to comment on this with RT seen from our point of view. I think it infantilizes the public in the West because it takes away the possibility for us to judge for ourselves. So I think the state that censors Russian propaganda just treats us as children. And they preserve the right for themselves to decide. And I also think it's very difficult to have a very clear definition of propaganda. Propaganda is only effective when it is based on some relationship with reality that in fact has factual basis. And I just want to remind you that there was no freedom of expression in Rwanda and Germany in the 30s. But I have a question for Erik, and maybe two. One is about the distinction between the ontological and the legal understanding of free speech. I understand what you are saying in the context of human rights and the debate about law. But if we talk about human beings in general and the fact that free speech has to do with culture, it has to do with norms that are not necessarily reflected in law, and if we see human beings as storytelling animals, what distinguishes us from others is that we have a language, and if you limit the right to tell and listen to stories that you want to, then it is in fact an attack on human nature to limit that right. That's my one question. The other one has to do with the concept of incitement in a digital world. I know you've discussed this with Robert Post, maybe a little bit, but does the digital world change our concept of incitement? Just to give you one example, if you have a bomb manual printed in a book, according to First Amendment practice, it will not be banned because there is no clear and present danger. You have to find the book, you have to read it, but if it exists online and you can distribute it online, then it becomes a very different matter. And I think you can generalize from that example to a lot of other situations where incitement, that is the distance between speech and action, is a lot more narrow than in the physical world. I mean, do we need to have, do we have to revise our understanding of incitement in a digital world, and will it have any influence on lawmaking and rules? Thank you.
Yes, go on.
Make sure I got this all down. Okay, so actually, I'd like to make 3 points, even though you only had 2 questions. I'm so glad that you raised this comparison to Nazi propaganda, which, you know, Nazism is still in so many ways an historical point of reference for so much that goes on in human rights. I would argue, of course, there's no way I can prove this. It's always the nice thing about these sorts of arguments. I would argue that the problem was never the propaganda. I would argue that the problem was that the propaganda was promulgated in a place where no one could argue with it. No one could hold it up to ridicule. No one could discuss it. That was the problem. This is another constant mistake in thinking about free speech, right? There was Nazi propaganda, and then there was genocide, as if that's the sole cause and effect. You read this all the time. No. The problem was not the propaganda. The problem was the context of the propaganda, one in which you could not argue with it. I'll just put that out there. As I said, I can't prove it. It's my suspicion. It's my hypothesis. Now, more directly onto what you were saying. I enormously appreciate both of those comments. As to your first comment about the homo storytellingus, I think that's quite right. Now, I think what you sort of remind us of is, and this is, I think, very much part of what I'm trying to say, is that a culture of free speech as we understand this is historically very rare, right? It's the aberration, right? We're kind of accustomed to it, almost as if it's a norm, and we have to just sort of start tinkering with the rules. Historically, I mean, the very concept of free speech, right, is the exception. Free speech as sort of equal political participation, right? Jakob was mentioning the relationship between free speech and equality early, because these are often set up as inimical, right? Now, quite the contrary, the idea of free speech for everyone is unthinkable throughout most of history, because most of history is not a history of egalitarian societies. Right? Most of history, is structured around classes, power hierarchies, right? Where even those at the top often have to be very careful about what they're saying, let alone, people who are often in positions of essentially servitude, which is, often the great mass of a population in any given culture throughout much of history, right? So much of human history is a story of societies where the very concept of free speech would make no sense. And this is crucial, I think, because as I was saying, right, I began by projecting, a half dozen ancient belief systems which are always trotted out to prove that human rights are universal, right? This is just, again, a kind of United Nations fairy tale. Right? Although it's amazing how many human rights lecturers love to talk about this, because it makes it all look terribly cosmopolitan and inclusive. It's just nuts. really. It's just silly. And I think you're quite right to emphasize how unusual a free speech culture is. In other words, I would add to this, how unusual historically, and you might say therefore precious, a human rights culture would be. Because again, we've so watered down the concept to the point of virtually extinguishing it. Yeah, that it just means the fact that throughout history, different cultures have had different understandings of justice. You don't need human rights to say that. Your second question is of course the hardest one of all, and it's the one that everyone in this area is now pondering. For the last decade or two, because it's true, right? When I was in law school, the model of free speech was, the town hall. This quaint little image of, nice little Protestant citizens coming together, to air their differences, right, in a very well-run and well-behaved setting. And of course, this is just nonsense for the world we're living in today. And so that's just not the paradigm anymore, the town hall meeting, right? Now it's this kind of global colossus. What's changed is our sense of causality. Right? When I was first starting to write about things and first studying them, there was not a single study. Even though, I did a lot of research on what was going on in Germany at the time, and there were, when there were movements to ban certain extremist political organizations, and you just had reams and reams of reports. None of them cited a single empirical study to show causation from harmful speech to harmful effects. No one. Nor anywhere else, nor in Britain or in the US. There was not a single empirical study after decades. That has changed. That is the change. I think in the online world, the causation is now demonstrable in many cases, right? Where somebody is sitting in his pajamas at 3 in the morning in a basement in London, and 2 hours later there's a massive riot in Pakistan, and 1,000 people are killed. That sort of thing. These things are happening now, and so we cannot deny a kind of causation. Right, which is very much linked to the problem of incitement. And so this is the number one theme now at every free speech conference I attend. And I think we're still working out, the relationship between state actors and private actors. What do we mean by a private actor when we're talking about these massive corporations, as Monica was saying before? Sorry, I'm rambling.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask the Commissioner on African development. One of the things that so earlier we published a report where we compared the case law on South Africa, South African Constitutional and Supreme Court of Appeal with the case law of the European Court of Human Rights on hate speech, and actually found that in general the South African courts were much more speech protective than when it comes to Europe, and they have sort of a different, so almost the opposite tendency of the European Court of Human Rights tends to say, because of the history of Europe, we have to be careful about allowing speech. That we have to clamp down on speech that could be dangerous to democracy and tolerance. South African courts have a different approach. They say because of our past, a very recent past of an apartheid regime that used censorship and repression to entrench white supremacy, we need to be very, very careful about providing the government means to, even if they sound nice, even if they're well-intentioned, to restrict free speech. And in my view, I think the South African model is a much more promising one when it comes to sort of approaching some kind of agreement at the international level, at international human rights law, for instance, where you should where you should delineate the concept of hate speech. Whether you're in favor of hate speech laws or not, I mean, they're going to be there because it's part of international human rights law, and you can be in favor or against that. But do you agree with that assessment, or and maybe also some of the other positive developments that you noticed in Africa that could be useful for grappling with these difficult questions going forward?
Yes, thank you very much. In fact, actually, the judiciary in different countries use the past to address questions that are rising in the future. That is in the present. So that, in fact, what has happened in the past justify their development of a law. And as you rightly pointed out, South Africa has come up with very progressive means of interpreting free speech. Whether other countries will follow suit is another thing. It's quite difficult to stay so far. But on the African continent, we have noticed that, in fact, there's a huge development towards accepting access to information and free speech. So at the Commission itself, we're trying to have dissemination campaigns on what it entails and how to draft laws and how to interpret them. But we are still at initial stages and hope that by the end of my mandate we'll be able to do it more effectively, and so that countries, they are scared of free speech and access to information. They are scared of what it will lead to. They are scared that this will lead to opening of state secrets or whatever. We're trying to show them that no, it doesn't mean that. What it would entail for you as a government, what it would entail for the people. So that is what we're trying to do at the moment. But I hope that we'll be able to succeed in that. And I think there was a gentleman there who asked about the technological and legal means. So what I stated is that governments have found two ways to deal with fake news and hate speech. One is the technological means, that is blocking and access to content, whereas the legal means is passing laws that block the speech itself. So these are the two means that governments have found to block fake news and hate speech. But unfortunately, when they're applying it, they're not applying it to just fake news and hate speech. They're applying it globally to dissenters and people that they do not want to have to access that information. In the interpretation of it, we're having problems. Probably what it was meant for, it was a good thing, but in the interpretation and the application, then it's slightly different, and it is not what it was intended for. Thank you.
Right. Please.
Actually, a short question, both to Eric and Galina. I was thinking about the propaganda as it is and about human psychology, because we do tend to notice voices that are louder than the others. And on the example of the recent events in Ukraine and Russia, before the full-blown war, the Russian voices were heard much louder, and their opinions were clear and sort of everywhere, including social media and including tons of trolls and tons of bots that were commenting everywhere. And the international society as such was less interested into knowing what's really going on. So in that cases, I feel like a lot of opinions have been sort of cemented on the fact that they heard first. Because we are humans, we have cognitive bias, and we, after we set on some opinions, we sort of just look for the confirmation of those opinions. We are less interested into finding what's really going on. So how do we deal with the situation when one player and one voice is simply louder and sort of has more resources than the others? It's not very fair when we think of it, right? But there's quite little what we can do about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So I think it would be too complicated to react on such a it's a serious question, and it's not legal. I think it's more about like media literacy and psychology. And of course, if people tend to read those sources of information that they like, they just kind of bubble within the sources that they agree with. And as a result, in some time, they just don't see and don't hear other voices. And it's dangerous by itself. So that we live in the same kind of information bubble. And I think that Russian civil society, for instance, and independent media, they also kind of like browse each other. So we read each other, we read independent media tend to read what their colleagues are reporting, and as a result, we created like totally different informational like societies, universes, I would say, which do not understand each other. So I think it's a problem that had to be addressed by, if not governments, because government is not actually interested, well, at least our government is not interested in that. They quite happily created this propaganda bubble to manipulate people. But in theory, countries supposed to look at this problem through the concept of media literacy, and if children are raised with understanding where's propaganda and how to distinguish proper reporting and balanced reporting, journalism and propaganda, advertisement and propaganda, they themselves, being adults, they will find the right way to find the reliable information. And I agree, we do not have to treat them as children. We do not create a comfortable surroundings like informational platforms for them. We have to show them the real world and let them choose the information they want to read and follow. And just as a note with regards to what Commissioner has said, that governments are actually trying to apply surgery tools for information. So they block information they don't like. They create laws, implement laws which would allow them to leave population with just propaganda, and that by itself is a very dangerous approach, because blocking can be misused. That's what is happening in Russia. They just use blocking as a tool to stop reporting, and that's will leave people with just a very unbalanced information as a result.
Sorry, you did. I think the concern you raise is crucial. Again, it's one of the main themes that we look at, I think, in the area of free speech, and there are no easy answers to it. It's true that an arena of free speech is inevitably one in which more powerful voices often prevail. Here's the problem, in my view. This argument is constantly used as a censorship tool. I don't know how many people here have heard the concept of cancel culture, right? This is obviously rampant in universities. I'm not saying it always succeeds, but it attempts to have certain speakers blocked because somehow they represent a more powerful and potentially or actually oppressive voice. Now, the problem is that if we look at anything that we consider to be a social problem, pretty much anything, I don't know, it could be environment, it can be poverty, it can be disease, you name it. Social problems always, almost by their nature as problems, involve power dynamics. There's usually always some disempowered group which suffers disproportionately from pretty much any social problem, poverty by definition. Right? But we can name just about any other now. If we, for example, in university settings, were always to cancel the speaker who represents the dominant or more powerful view, we would literally first of all, we would have to pretty much banish every economics department in the Western world, right? Because if they're even remotely promoting things such as free markets, they're inevitably promoting systems which involve power imbalances and which tend to entrench them. But more generally, for any social problem, we would only ever get to hear one side. You see, I'm not accusing you of going this far, but unfortunately, this question about censoring or limiting speech because certain people have a more privileged voice, I don't see any practical rule, right, which could rationally redress power imbalances within the sphere of discourse. And so, again, while I take on board the problem, I think we also have to be very, very careful about exaggerating it, because it would justify censoring one half of pretty much any discussion on any controversial issue, which will always involve power imbalances.
Please.
Ben, thank you. To Eric, I would tend to agree with your questioning the ranking by UN committees of countries from Norway to North Korea. What can we learn from that? The other thing, my other thought is that just recently, Mr. Borrell of the European Union got to acknowledge that for the last 2 decades, Europe has been too naive for Russian aggression. But my question to you, Eric, and maybe the panel, do you have a proposal on its way for a new international order when what we have does not work?
A new international order?
Yeah.
Well, we have 10 minutes. I'm thinking about how to rephrase that question into something more handleable. I'm failing right now. But I think it's impossible for us to answer that question in such a, yeah. Do you?
Well, I think, I think it's not so far from the question that you put to me earlier. So I guess in about 10 minutes it became unanswerable, right? But yeah, no, right, because you were also asking, you know, if I understood you correctly, well, you know, then what do we do if we've just been deluding ourselves all this time about having a kind of international human rights regime, you know, which I'm claiming we don't have at all and we never had. And this is why I had said to Martin before, again, for me, step one is just to be honest about where we are now, right? To be honest that what we're doing in these international organizations is not fundamentally about human rights. I'm not even saying that's necessarily bad, right? Maybe, as I said, human goods are good. Right? And so if that's all we're really concerned about, again, making sure that goods are in place and encouraging countries to humanize their regimes and to provide ever more and greater goods, maybe that's not bad. That more humble, right, less ambitious, right? All I'm saying is that we simply have not understood what human rights are if we're calling any of that a regime of rights, right? What would have to change would be, again, it's only rights when people can safely and confidently agitate for them. That's what makes it an individual right. Otherwise, it's not. You know, I'm not sure. You know, again, as you know, as our Justitia friends here are arguing, in many ways, we're receding. We're going in the opposite direction. We're getting more repression.
Can I ask all of you, why do you think we are in a freedom of speech recession? Why is it happening? What is the?
Well, I mean, I would say we're getting a simultaneous explosion and repression, or explosion and recession. We're getting both at the same time. Yeah. I don't think we can see one is exclusive of the other. You know, in some ways, in terms of sheer quantity and volume, we have immeasurably more speech, right? In some ways, immeasurably freer than ever in human history. But I don't think that makes our friends from Justitia incorrect. Right, in saying that at the same time, in direct response to this, right, that this is encouraging autocratic regimes to crack down.
You nod. You agree?
Of course, because I think we're having an explosion of information via the social media. It's taken everyone by surprise, the variety and the depth of it. So I think in trying to cope with that, there is a clampdown, and that is creating the problems. Right. But the clampdowns are not just on hate speech and other things. It's about everything that they do not want.
Yeah. Do you think they are? Do you think they are like Erdogan and Putin and authoritarian leaders around? Are they coordinating? Are they learning from each other right now? Are they?
They definitely are.
And they're doing quite well.
And unfortunately, not just from each other.
Right.
They also, like Putin and the Russian parliament was always referring to examples from European countries, like, look, the foreign agent legislation, that's United States. The right to be forgotten is EU.
Right. We have one more question, but let me just ask you before, so I have the chance to ask mine here, because this is related to this. You said that the huge technological platform, social media, is the most important tool right now in the non-democratic world in enhancing this, in reversing this. But in our part of the world, we tend to see the same platforms as problems that has to be controlled, that we have to limit the damage that they're doing. There is a kind of contrast here in how we see the same phenomena.
Well, because in other jurisdictions, social media were accepted as like an entertainment, mostly like Facebook in the United States is mainly for like the everyday content. It's not for political speech and not a platform for free expression. So I think it's just, it puts more responsibility for the on platforms. And since they provide some new regulation which is above jurisdictions, we deal with something complete, like new, and it's a phenomenon. And my understanding why we observe this recession and freedom of expression globally, because we are facing from one side, explosion of freedom of expression and exchange of information and free flow of information, and people became kind of journalists themselves because they can publish anything anywhere on social media. So that's jeopardizes like the whole principle of professional journalism, and they don't know how to address sometimes. But at the same time, governments, they've been observing development of internet and social media for a decade, and now they're kind of ready to regulate it. And look what we have as a result. Governments are regulating internet and social media for like Russia, China, Malaysia. They're trying to introduce regulation putting pressure on these high-tech giants, which are actually American companies registered in the United States, working under American legislation, and they don't really want to report back to Russian media regulator or to Malaysian government, and they don't want to comply with like requests to take down the content. So all that is a complex issue, and it has to be dealt with on international level. And we have problems and crises with international mechanisms, and UN mechanism is not effective anymore. So it has to be reformed somehow to address all these new challenges.
Yes, over here.
Hi, good afternoon. My question is for Galina. It's very thought-provoking, your discussion, but you did mention a little bit about the financialization of independent media in exile. I think in the overall global development arena, as what Eric could also mention earlier, there's the power dynamics between international funders and the organizations that they funded to. I wonder if you have an impression, because you don't work as an independent media in exile, but you work with them. I wonder if you have an impression how independent media in exile thread this path of free speech in this dyadic relationship with their international funders. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure whether I've got your question right. So let me put it like that. So independent media, like if we talk about Russian media in exile, they have lost the financial stability while they've been, when they've been blocked in Russia and relocated. When the war started, they have lost monetization, any kind of income which they received from YouTube and other social media. So that actually ruined the financial sustainability of media. So they had to relocate the whole team with families, with studios, so that cost a fortune. They have lost all the advertisement, like Medusa, for instance, when they've been declared as a foreign agent in April last year, 95% of their companies, they posted advertisement on their website, withdrawn, and some of them requested to take down advertisement which was published 7 years prior the moment when Medusa was designated as a foreign agent. So that left them with put them down on a 0 point when they just started. But they've been supported by crowdfunding. Then next, Russian citizens are banned to use MasterCard and Visa. So we don't, well, particularly those who are relocated, we don't have access to our bank accounts, outside the country, from outside. So we cannot support ourselves. International support from general public is not that strong because people don't really understand how these all Russian media in exile work and why they should support them if they're relocated to France, Germany, Latvia, Georgia, and other jurisdictions. So it's just a problem which it's a very serious issue, and independent media, they, in many cases, they now are dependent on funders, on donors, on charity organizations, but it cannot last forever. They have to find the way to actually be financial sustainability as business, and it's extremely difficult to re-establish yourself as a business if you are Russian media working in exile in a foreign jurisdiction, because it just doesn't work like it. It was never a business model to establish a foreign media in another country. I don't know how it will work in the future, but now we see that this concept of creating a shelter for Russian media in exile, it's under threat because of TV rain situation in Latvia and in Baltic countries. So it clearly shows us that they might be in danger once again and have to relocate second time within 1 year. So imagine how to create a stable funding and financial support of the team and continue actually reporting 24 hours on a speed 200 kilometers per hour, because they actually have to be on top of all the news and cover a situation in the country, outside country. When they lose funding, they lose access to their sources, they lose journalists on the ground. So this is just a really complex issue, I'm afraid. But so more to discuss on different platforms and different events and between different actors. Because I think this is crucial to still support the free flow of information, independent reporting, even if those media have to work from relocation now, hopefully not forever.
Okay. Thanks so much, Ourveena, Galina, and Eric. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and for the great discussion. Give them all a hand. Very well deserved.